Now, the present lecture is concerned with discussing the relations of three dimensions of our conscious being in the world: the behavioral, the phenomenological, and the neural. Our being consciously alive in the world certainly involves all three of them. We must be acted upon the world, and we must react to it like any other worldly object. But to be consciously alive, the world must also be there for us. It must be given to us in a variety of ways, lights and guises. And in addition, we have to have a nervous system and brain, and above all, a cortex, in order to be effectively in the world and in order for the world to be effectively there for us. But how these factors contribute to our conscious being in the world is somewhat obscure and controversial. And it has been so since the beginning of philosophy, and remains so despite the shifts of emphasis due to the shifting discoveries of science. These discoveries, again and again, have seemed to revolutionize the whole picture and to flood all its well-known landmarks. But again and again, with the retreat of the tide, the old landmarks have reasserted themselves, perhaps a bit more covered with sand and silt, or a little freer from them. The surmise suggests itself that here we are up against a distinction of categories, of things that you cannot overturn or establish by experiment, because they are the presuppositions of experiment, because they must be as they are if we are to be able to observe anything or to learn from our observations. Perhaps the general character of these factors and the general character of their interrelation are all necessary and categorical. They provide a framework within which science can do its detailed investigations and achieve its discoveries, rather than anything which science, instead of profound philosophical reflection, can hope to throw detailed light. But there's also the rather interesting possibility, which will be touched on at the end of this lecture, that there is something rather special and at once advantageous and disadvantageous about the particular way of being alive, consciously alive, that involves so special a mediating embodiment as the cortex. The human brain and its bark are plainly, on the one hand, the highest product of organic evolution. They represent the highest pinnacle of integration and flexibility of response that organic existence has achieved. But on the other hand, it can be argued that there is something rather cut off, divorced from the grassroots of being, something stilted, parasitic, and falsely privileged about this cortical life of ours, and that our philosophical difficulties are among the many fruits of this stilted position. Like St. Simeon Stylites on his column, we are so elevated above the rough and tumble of the marketplace that we are fundamentally confused as to what may be going on there. And scientists, I would suggest, are as much or more in the position of St. Simeon Stylites than ordinary people. Possibly, if one goes down to the evolutionary ladder or simply goes down to the humble units in our own body, one has in one hand cases of life and experience that are much less cut off from environing reality and from other conscious existences, and so much less angled and paradoxical and prone to difficulties than ours necessarily is. Possibly also there are levels of conscious being to which we can in some illuminated moments attain, and which we may enjoy more fully in some later state, in which the detailed effects of cortical mediation will be set aside, with the consequent reduction in the philosophical and other riddles which so beset us in this life. These suggestions will recur at the end of this lecture, though we shall make them without confidence. Of all riddles in the world, those which attend on our involvement with brains are the most intractable. Well, I must leave generalities aside, and I must proceed to say something about the three dimensions of our conscious being that I have distinguished. Now, the first, the behavioral, is one whose logic has only been explored in the present century. from Watson through Tolman, Holt, Dewey, and Mead to Ryle. Though at first seemingly tractable and straightforward, it has proved as rich in mare's nests and metaphysics as any other philosophical dimension. Quite plainly, as beings consciously in the world and its contents and its remote structural appendages had to impinge upon us causally in countless direct and indirect ways, either through the senses or through revivals of the senses, or through countless subtle transformations of sensory data, or through countless social and linguistic influences impinging on us from the environment. We have had to respond to these influences in a variety of direct and simple or very varied and flexible ways. Now, at the beginning, the notion of a behavioral response seems straightforward and unambiguous. We can see a man striking the table, raising his voice, swiveling his eyeballs to the left, and so on. It is, however, plain that a behavioral response is only a behavioral response if it is a response to something or other. And what one is responding to, even if one is an animal, is not at all obvious from the situation open to examination. The behaving being may not be responding to anything present in the situation, but to something present in situations in the past, or to something behind barriers connected with the present situation by quite a long track or route. It may even be something general, such as food, or a triangle, or something entirely non-existent and imaginary. A savage responds to mysterious properties like mana, or mysterious acts like casting the evil eye upon one, or trapping someone's soul in a photograph, etc. And even if there is a response to something definitely in the immediate environment, it is not clear from what is done in what light the object is being responded to, as dangerous, as triangular, as a sign of the right road to Buenos Aires, etc., etc. What the mental situation is for us only comes out after an exhaustive testing of our responses in many situations. And not only is it not clear what we are responding to and how it comes before us, but also what sort of a response we are making. In eating a white powder, are we attempting suicide, or eating a sweetmeat, or pretending to do one or the other? Or is it merely a link in a complex purposive chain, etc.? All these are points which require indefinite testing to establish what they portend. Not only is this so, but what a being is doing can only be understood in the total constellation of its contemporary and past responses. It must be contemplated as a whole and not merely in one part or moment. And our contemplation must extend beyond the actual into the probable or the hypothetical. All this means that the behavioral dimension of our conscious being in the world is a vastly metaphysical affair, not all lying on the surface as the early behaviorists, tired of mentalistic mystification, supposed and hoped. It manifests what we may call remote intentionality or transcendent concern, and it may be concerned with what is remote or general or even unreal as much as with what is concrete and actual. It is also invariably angled, concerned with what it is concerned with from a subtle, not easily ascertainable point of view. It also has a higher universality, both in what it responds to and in the nature of its response, which enables it to substitute one line of reaction for another, or one object of reaction for another, almost without limit. It has a strange overall unity which makes it hard and complex to study, and it has a power of modifying its responses and retreating to higher levels of universal and new specifications of the same, which is neither routine nor random, but in the best sense of the word, insightful and creative. Behavior thus qualified can be interpreted, and interpreted with confidence in very many cases. But its interpretation involves a taking seriously of much that is neither concrete or real, and vastly much that is dispositional rather than actual. Behavior is, of course, an essential dimension of conscious being in the world, not some irrelevant expression of it as earlier thinkers supposed. But it is not, however, a dimension that lends itself to mere observation, or that is free from profound obscurities. What I'm saying may not be evident to everyone, because they think of the simple expedient of asking people what they are intending, what they are doing, how things look to them, and so on, forgetting, you see, that this asking involves an interpretation of their attitude, which is really not behavioral. The kind of interpretation when you ask people a question is a phenomenological kind of interpretation. You have to put yourself in their place and see how the thing appears from their point of view. It is, however, impossible to stop at this point in mind theory, nor is what one has capable of standing on its own legs, if not supplemented by another phenomenological approach. The world must not only be there and the living conscious being responding to it. The world and its contents and attachments must also be there for the intelligent being, or must be capable of being there for it. And being there for it or present to it is not, despite attempts to the contrary, analyzable in terms of mere behavior, however varied and refined. There must, in order that there should be conscious being in the world, be something that I shall speak of metaphorically as a phenomenological screen, on which objects, including the viewing subject, must appear before the viewing subject, must be given or intended in a variety of ways. It is plain that in default of such a phenomenological screen or its possibility, the behavioral dimension would not be one of conscious life at all. It would not even, particularly in respect of its objects, be capable of a satisfactory pinning down. And it is more than arguable that the whole world and its contents would be nothing that we could talk about or refer to or understand, unless the second phenomenological dimension were also capable of being talked about and understood. For it is only possible and meaningful to talk about or recognize this or that thing or state of affairs if it is also possible and meaningful to talk about and recognize the acts of understanding and reference in which that thing or state of affairs is referred to or understood. To understand objects and states of affairs is to understand the understanding of them, and a world whose understanding we did not understand would be an unworld, a mere nothing, not an object of significant reference. This is a very elaborate Cartesian proof. It may not have conveyed conviction to you, but nevertheless I believe it is irrefragable. That is, in short, to talk of a world in which creatures behave and not to talk of the acts or processes in which that world is given to you or becomes an object for you is to talk of something which is nothing. I mean, you are not dealing with anything real unless there is some gathering together of what you talk, unless it can be there for you. It doesn't really matter that I am in the world and I'm responding. If I'm indulging in language games or whatnot, if I do not know, if these are not realities for me, if they are not gathered together and seen as a whole and grasped and understood by me in a certain way, if they are not phenomena for me, if they do not, in addition to whatever existence they may have independently of me, also appear on my phenomenological screen in the various characteristic ways in which a thing does appear on a phenomenological screen. This is, of course, a metaphor. There is the full logic of conscious grasp, of intentional reference, is, however, far from easy, and it has only been satisfactorily unraveled in the past century, beginning with Brentano's masterpiece, The Psychology from the Empirical Standpoint, in 1878, and carried further by a large number of intentionalist and phenomenological thinkers, such as Meinong, Edmund Husserl, Roman Ingarden, Moritz Geiger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and such wilder existentialists as Heidegger and Sartre. Though they have many divergences of doctrine and terminology, all may be said to believe in a sort of immanent transcendence, a capacity to point consciously to what is beyond oneself and to make it the target of one's concern, without thereby affecting it causally or being affected by it causally, or in fact going beyond the circle of one's own inner personal life. This property of remote concern has the further remarkable property that it may be of things unreal and not there at all, but only there for the subject, but that it may likewise be of things real and independent of the subject, and as much known by the subject to be thus independent of himself and to be real and not merely thought to be so. It also has the remarkable property of being always in some manner and degree present to itself, so that in being aware of this or that transcendent thing or state of affairs, we also ipso facto are aware of our own awareness of this or that thing or state of affairs, and can, if we will, bring the self-experience into a more developed analytic form. The realm of mental references proliferates with infinite variety. We can be conscious of things clearly or marginally, predicatively or non-predicatively, sensuously or imaginatively or symbolically or notionally, believingly or doubtingly or entertainingly, approvingly or disapprovingly, or hopefully or fearfully, and so on. The study of all these attitudes and their relationships to one another and their objects is a matter of infinite complication, in whose unraveling an analyst like Husserl is supremely skilled. The phenomenological dimension shows the same properties of remote concern, of high-level universality, of angled presentation, and of the abstracted giving of angles as such, and also of profound flexibility and open universality as the behavioral dimension. But there is much less metaphysical obscurity about the phenomenological than the behavioral dimension. We do not need to test ourselves in a variety of real and actual situations to know that we are afraid that we may have said the wrong thing and committed a social blunder, and that we must now have recourse to some desperate maneuver to cover our embarrassment. All this is clear and comes out in verbal reports. But though less obscure than the behavioral dimension, the phenomenological dimension is, from another point of view, much more dependent and parasitic. The world is given to us, as Hume pointed out, in broken snatches, which are never fully carried out or fitted together. The point of view is continuously being shifted. The whole proceeding is continually being interrupted by periods of unconsciousness or sleep. Those constructive idealists who believe that the phenomenological perspective is also the only real one have to put up with a reality that is largely a welter of fragments, or to supplement it by the activities of something unconscious or godlike. We can at best say that our moments of lucid grasp are always hedged about with an infinite number of readinesses for lucid consciousness, which hover about on the perimeter of conscious experience, which, though not brought to fulfillment, remain real forces in the phenomenological and also in the behavioral field, and channel the appearances and our reactions to them, even though they do not themselves offer themselves to our self-examination. I have to use Husserl's expression, I have, to use Husserl's expression, always something im Griff, on hand, in grasp, ready to transform itself into full conscious grasp should occasion offer, but still relevantly influential, even if not so allowed or able to develop. Now, the dispositional surroundings of the phenomenological dimension is as all-pervasive as that of the behavioral dimension. Both are therefore in much the same manner metaphysical, supplementing the given with entities which must certainly be believed in, even if not given. What I've been trying to say is that the persuasion that many people have had that the behavioral dimension is the lucid dimension and the phenomenological or subjective or introspective dimension is hard to fathom are totally delusive. They both have profound metaphysical difficulties of their own. The understanding of either involves bringing in concepts of a very extraordinary and difficult character, and it involves believing in the reality of dispositions. I have no difficulty in believing in dispositions, but many people have. They want tin tacks, and they feel these are not tin tacks. We have therefore on our two dimensions of conscious life in the world, the external causal dimension and the internal phenomenological or intentional dimension. Mediating the two and perhaps having both causal and intentional features. Now, I use the word intentional to mean referential in the specific sense that is used by the schoolmen and also by Brentano. Mediating both these dimensions is the dimension of the neurons and at the higher level of the cortex. It is plain that phenomenology and high-grade action are not mediated by the body as a whole. Despite the phenomenological showings to the contrary, the psyche would not appear to exist totum in toto and totum in qualibet parte, as the scholastic thinkers supposed. I mean, you think that your mind, your conscious experience is in your toes, but any sort of cutting of a nerve above the toes will soon show you that the toes themselves are not sufficient to give you any awareness or nor any behavior. I mean that it is here and here alone that we have a direct connection with phenomenology and also with behavior. But to have a direct relation only to certain higher regions of the nervous system, and in particular to those of the cortex or outer bark of the brain. Plainly, we have no clairvoyant perception of the things around us, or if we have it, it is grossly overlaid. Personally, I believe that we at all times have a very clairvoyant perception of the environment and especially of the persons in it. And people like dowsers and so forth have it in a more developed manner, but certainly we do not have it in any clear way. The world is there for us by stimulating sense terminals which agitate nerves, which cause disturbances in appropriate regions of the cortex. Now, the older philosophers thought of appearances called sensations, which entered almost nude on the phenomenological stage, and there received an elaborate process of interpretative recostuming and lighting and cosmetics, till they became the perceived objects that we now recognize. We now know that the elaborate recostuming and cosmetics takes place at lower levels and is not based on the redundant sensations that one artificially analyzes out of our perceptual experience. Sometimes such sensations are actually absent. It is quite outside of the phenomenological sphere. The disparate visual stimulations give rise to percepts of depth, or disparate oral stimulations give rise to percepts of the direction of sounds, or stimulations of the semicircular canals in the inner ear give rise to percepts of posture and direction. In some cases there have been phases of conscious interpretation, which in the course of time have lapsed into unawareness. But in many cases the interpretation has been pre-conscious. Our position, in fact, is like that of some high-born aristocrat who receives all his food beautifully cooked and prepared and served up by unknown minions in the kitchen, and who also, as happens in Japanese inns, has a beautiful lady to put the food into his mouth. And on the other side, all our elaborately adjusted intelligent responses can be shown to involve an elaborate series of nerve pullings, which influence vastly many relaxations and contractions of muscles, and receive a regulated feedback from these muscles, which promote further exercises in wire pulling. We are all, it would appear, marionettes, members of the family of Pinocchio. Our simplest acts at any moment involve a continuum of back-feeding wire pulls. To imagine what is neurally happening when a lovely girl in lightsome mood runs across the sea, along the seashore playing with a barking dog, is to carry the complications of puppetry to a point where they become unpleasant. Surely so many mechanisms cannot be needed to effect a result so unitary and so charmingly simple. But plainly, conscious being in the world is an affair of complexity and difficulty. It involves the imposition of a new kind of order and governance by general patterns and remote intentional objects on a rabble of molecules that are not naturally integrated into higher unities of any sort, which do not naturally follow patterns which are not those of their isolated selves, and whose commerce with intentional objects, if they have any, is certainly of the vaguest and the slightest. So that only by organizing and regimenting them in the vastly elaborate wire-pulling way in which they are organized and regimented, can we achieve that ordered perception of the environment and that adjusted response to its details which conscious being in the world involves. But our subservience to our cellular and molecular minions and the mechanical chains in which they are ordered goes very plausibly much further. They not only present us with doctored and slanted pictures of the environment, and they not only carry out our executive decisions, but like an intrusive bureaucracy, they take part in all the proceedings of the council chamber and throughout channel its deliberations and decisions. It is not enough that we should have been through certain experiences in the past. Our access to them plausibly demands a touching off by the henchmen who have also, in a humbler capacity, been through them. Without their cooperation, a mere recall or an imaginatively modified replay would not for some reason be possible. And it seems likely that even our most attenuated higher order acts of understanding and decision, which involve a readiness to encounter or imagine countless sorts of things, or to make countless verbal or wordless references to them, and to do countless things that would count as responses to them, that these involve some sort of complex silent play on the neural organ, a pulling out of stops and a putting of a damper on others, even if no actual sound emerges from the metaphorical organ. It seems further plausible to hold that some of the high-grade unconscious rearrangements of our total readiness, from which full-fledged conscious phenomena and adjusted actions issue, is a rearrangement in which the neural henchman or organ stops, or however you wish to describe them, play a not unimportant part. When we display that inspired absence of mind, which is so misleadingly called wit or presence of mind, it seems arguable that these henchmen motivate a doing or saying of the right thing long before its content or its rightness have been projected onto the phenomenological screen. All these facts and likely extensions of fact prompt an inclination to pass from a view in which we are, as conscious living beings involved in the world, are also involved in some unconscious use of the cortex, as if some instrument through which we affect the world and the world affects us, to a view in which the cortex rather does everything and is responsible for everything, and in which the total phenomenological picture before us and the ordered behavior that we execute are alike cortical manifestations. It is then possible to shift to a view in which the phenomenological subject becomes a sort of happy fainéant, contemplating and enjoying processes which he neither initiates nor really controls. It's rather a pleasant fantasy. I mean, the real point is you don't do anything at all. Everything gets done for you, but you contemplate it. You are the screen on which it's all projected. What a wonderful release from guilt. I mean, no matter what's happening, it's the cortex that's doing it. You are simply enjoying the process. It's simply being screened in front of you, whether it's a murder or a speech such as I'm giving at the moment. Well, I mean, it's alike. It's very interesting, very curious. But this picture soon shifts by an inherent dialectic to a more sinister view in which we identify ourselves with the cortex, which is alike responsible for all the appearances before us and for all our conscious reactions. The cortex then becomes the true man, concealed in the ivory tower of the skull bones, to whom we must attribute all our highest perceptive, cogitative, emotional, and practical feats. It ceases to be a mere corpus of convoluted cells and becomes a metaphysically extended reality, referring, universalizing, integrating, and innovating in a manner never routine nor random. It pinned the declaration on the Wittenberg Cathedral and did other acts such as you might wish to mention of the same sort. In fact, Hegel has a characteristic passage in the Phenomenology where the phrenologists say everything is the bumps on the skull. And Hegel says, yes, perhaps, but the skull bones then acquire all the properties of spirit. They become totally transformed. They no longer are what we thought them to be. I believe, however, that this dialectic has carried us too far, and that we cannot justifiably push the cortical contribution to this limit. It can at best be an instrument or extension of the reactive phenomenological agent, not the latter an extension of it. The difficulties in the ways of a thoroughgoing neuralism are logical. They rest on the difficulty of modelling something that displays remote intentionality in a medium that only displays actual descriptive structures, and in modelling high-level universality, an endless retreat to higher levels of universality in a medium that cannot plausibly reflect all the higher level affinities that are thus implied. It is no good attributing everything to the cortex if we are not prepared and also not able to think of it as the sort of thing to which such attributions can be made, and if we are not prepared or able to evolve a view of it which engenders a true isomorphism between it and various behavioral and phenomenological features. I mean, a tremendous amount of talk of what is built into the nervous system or the brain or something is a pure asylum of ignorance. I mean, at one time, everything you attributed to the soul and its marvelous properties. And this is now very, very disreputable. But nowadays you say quite that the three dimensions of space have been built into the nervous system or something like that. Or you say similar things about the use of language or something like that. And these are mere talk. It is absolutely meaningless talk. It is superstitious and ungrammatical. And it is far worse than the soul, because the soul at least was invisible and things might be attributed to it which were of doubtful character. But the point is that they're plainly nonsensical when attributed to what we see, and they derive all their credit and supposed luminosity from the fact that we can see the wretched thing which is supposed to do all these mysterious and transcendental things. Now, it appears arguable that when we consider remote intentionality, we have an adjustment to what lies at the object end of our references rather than what lies at the personal immediate end. It is what we are dealing with rather than our own impression of it that determine how our perceptual and thought expectations develop and how we react to their objects. It is hard to see how what is not mirrored even in the stimuli which affect our bodies, which may not even have any actual reality, can be precisely mirrored in structures and changes which cannot readily be credited with a concern for objects and connections beyond themselves. A neurone could conceivably, by a suitable anthropomorphism, be supposed to be socially embarrassed by the conduct of a fellow neurone, which is perhaps conducting impulses too readily or doing it in an unsuitable and noisy manner. But can we meaningfully attribute to a neurone concern with the social embarrassment of the total conscious person who finds some other total conscious person behaving unsuitably or vulgarly, and wonders how he can plausibly tone down his companion's social misdemeanors? I'm trying simply to give you an example, something infinitely subtle based on a complex set of social relations. It often happens to us to be embarrassed by the conduct of somebody whom we've taken to a gathering with us, who behaves, talks loudly and unsuitably, betrays his ignorance, is a bit forthcoming where he should be modest and retreating. We wish, how can we get him to be silent? How can we tell him to shut up? How can we hurry him away, or perhaps explain to others that he's after all not very well educated or something? I mean, these embarrassments, of course, neurons may have similar embarrassments at their level, as I say, with the conduct of other neurons. But how they can be guided by this remote concern with an objective situation out in the world and involving people and total people and their relations with one another, how these cells or molecules can be disturbed with this or determined by this, as they are undoubtedly determined, this eludes my understanding. Perhaps some have the wit to see how all this is possible. But to me it sounds like showing how black marks on paper can, in default to suitable interpreters, touch off a revolution or an execution. I can understand how black marks writing on paper saying, kill Mayor Daley or something, might produce a result on you, provided you read them and so forth. But how these could, as it were, by some own magic of their own, produce any result of this sort, this I do not understand. It is easy to say how the stimuli which impress themselves on our sense organs at a given time should be precisely mirrored in the pattern of excitations or their reactivation. But it is not so easy to see how the objective sense of these stimuli, changing from moment to moment, should be so mirrored. Despite the ingenuity of Kafka and his remarkable principles of Gestalt psychology, a masterpiece of speculative neurology, important in virtue of its very unsuccess, it is not easy to see how the pattern of some joke should complete itself or round itself off after the fashion of a sensory pattern, and how it should be able to evoke and transfer its influence to a whole series of further jokes, all exemplifying the same principles. A half-sketched circle might plausibly be able to transform itself into a completed circle by the action of purely neural and ultimately of physico-chemical forces. But I cannot see that this is possible in the case of a joke or of a series of jokes. Such perception and such a sense of humour I cannot, despite all the goodwill in the world, attribute to my neural henchman, either alone or in any combination. This leads me to stress the high-level universality of the more inspired conscious performances. Their guidance by, or their procedure along, constantly profounder relations of resemblance and affinity and logical connection, rather than by anything obviously there in the environment or the neural situation. We see an identity of principle in quite different phenomena, as when Verlaine likened autumn to the long sob of a violin in tune with his own monotonous mood. It is also shown when we switch style or skill to a quite different pattern of action in a truly innovating, creative manner. What is remarkable about the phenomenological behavioral subject is the open nature of its sensitivity to universality, its free creativity. It makes and unmakes its programs as it goes along, and ascends to ever higher styles of coordination without ever being wholly routine or wholly random in what it does. The German idealists attributed properties which they called infinity and absolute negativity to the conscious person. Such a person is never committed to anything definite or finite, but can revise himself without limit. His being, as the existentialists say, transcends any essence. I do not know how such boundless negativity can be attributed to the cortex, much as I am willing to allow this latter some unpredictable degree of spontaneity. It can perhaps innovate, but can it innovate in the indefinite synthesis of high-level meanings? Even if all definite, detailed encounters were precisely mirrored in the cortex, and even if each feature of everything was perpetually retained by a separate cell, I still cannot see how objectively appropriate selections could be made from what is called the stored information, or how suitable combinations of the abstracted features of things could be intelligently combined. I mean, supposing there is somewhere a neuron in my brain, which is the neuron for, what shall we say, for melancholy, And so how does this, how do we get the combination of melancholy with whatever else is required in such an original thing, or monotony, to give the case, in such an original manner as in the Verlaine poem? Or, alternatively, supposing you store in my cortex every experience that I had on June the 29th, 1943, then you have the problem of selecting from that material whatever I want to select. And yet this can be done. I can select the social embarrassments I've been in over my whole life. I can remember when I was 14, when this or that happened to me, or I was compelled to go to Judge Bristow's party, whose children I did not like, and I sat all the time in a room reading an album or something because I so detested this party, and so on. I can really give you a documented account of my social embarrassments, and yet this is not something which I willingly think of or very frequently construct, and yet it can be done. Obviously, the whole view of the cortex as the sole agent behind behavior and phenomenology is unacceptable. It involves an ignoring of distinct logical types and of categorical distinctions, and those who confuse types or categories, we know, never prosper. Wittgenstein said that the meaning of words was not anything inwardly or outwardly correlated with them, but lay in their use, in what they led us to expect and do, and in what circumstances. Now, I am far from endorsing everything Wittgenstein says, but on this occasion I shall borrow a leaf from his book. I shall say that the meaning of neural structures and processes is something which goes beyond them, and which can therefore be meaningly equated with the manner in which they are used by the living conscious being in the world. The cortex is not some perfect face, by studying which in isolation we shall be able to see exactly the content and character of every perception, thought, feeling, dream, wish, or decision. It is a face as imperfectly expressive as our ordinary face, the sense of whose proceedings lies in the endlessly unfolding vistas of phenomenology and the endlessly unfolding feats of adjusted practice. That the meaning of the cortex and its neurons lies in its use will not, however, necessarily drive us to believe in some immaterial user, only in a user who, though cortically active, also has functions that transcend those of the cortex. And we may, in fact, follow certain wise philosophers like Hegel in believing that unorganized matter must be credited with a steady urge towards its own self-transcendence, a movement towards the integration, the intentionality, and the high-level universality and innovation which are characteristic of our conscious life in the world, and which appears in those imperfectly developed but nonetheless effective readinesses for consciousness which are active throughout all levels of the nervous system. I return very briefly, and perhaps you will be shockingly, at the end of my lecture, to the suggestion I made at the beginning, that the puzzles that worry us concerning the cortex, as well as most other philosophical problems, may themselves be the product of something peculiar in our conscious situation, in which the cortex also plays a part. The philosophy of mechanistic neuralism, with its deep unsuccess and constant generation of philosophical surds, may itself be a product of cortical involvement, of the cortical predicament. It may, in fact, be the philosophy of the cortex in more senses than one. And it may be only by a transcendence of this predicament, either in certain this-life experiences or in experiences beyond this life, that these surds will be wholly eliminated. Let me suggest, without working my suggestions out, how cortically mediated conscious life may introduce surds into our general view of the world. It may do so precisely by depriving us of the undoctored sensations which the older psychologists and philosophers believed us to have, and so giving us a world of remote objects, fully interpreted, which stand over against our subjectivity, without giving us the sensations in which subject and object meet, and in both what is in us and what transcends us are felt as in unity. This gulf is particularly deep in the case of the perception of other people, which appear something remote, inferential, requiring a strange exercise of self-transcendence, whereas in the case of simpler organisms, there may very well be an osmotic sharing of the experiences of others, which we in certain semi-mystical moods adumbrate, but never effectively consummate. Our cortically mediated perception is, for further, such as to direct the perceptual world into neat, bright units set apart from each other, each given by a separate informational channel, and so absolutely independent. And we accordingly tend to think in terms of hard, bright, separate factors, capable of being put together and taken apart without change, and to see their intercourse as something rigorously prefigured in each other, in each of them, and admitting nothing of the creative or the unpredictable. And it is the remote, dirempted character of cortical perception that makes the cortex itself seem such a senseless, dead thing, so utterly unlike the behavioral and phenomenological developments that pass through it, and which then tempts us to reduce the latter to the former, and so to indulge in all the hopeless mystifications of speculative neurology. Speculative and even experimental neurology is itself a product of the cortical predicament. It is the strained reflection of what is arguably an unnatural condition. We may go further and hold that a great deal of scientific methodology, with its belief in invariant, isolable factors and rigorous laws governing their interaction, is itself a cortically inspired program. It is a program that may be implemented at the lower levels of lifeless nature, but which represents a defective ideal of explanation, and one imperfectly applicable at the level of life and mind. And it is our state of cortical immersion which pushes most of the preparatory work of consciousness into the realm of the dispositional, and so leads us to attribute to the cortex what only motivates its changes. On the whole, it is arguable that we live in a cave, seeing only broken and puzzling reflections of being, but that cave is the cortex, or varying the metaphor, the cortex is the high prison enclosed by the skull bones, where we see and deal with all in a perhaps biologically advantageous but philosophically confused manner. Still, as philosophy thrives on confusion, we may perhaps bless the cortex for making philosophy possible. To what do these reflections tend? To the suggestion that there may be forms of conscious being in the world not cortically mediated, which we enjoy intermittently in this present life, but which we shall enjoy more unbrokenly hereafter. There will be forms of conscious being in which we shall not have to compromise with the scrofulous tenantry which at present make up our bodies, and do everything in and by their instrumentality. We shall live and move among one another in bodies that have many of the qualities of the imaginary, together with a spice of communicable publicity, until at a higher remove we require them no longer. Our present dim but strong sense of the experience of others, both hidden and revealed by their actions, will perhaps yield to a facultative incorporation and temporary osmosis, which explains our deep certainty and understanding of them down here. And instances and their false hardness and multiplicity will vanish, yielding a direct commerce with those universals which inspire all our inductive exercises, and which culminate in a supreme universal which has been dimly hinted at by Plato and Plotinus. At any rate, I would suggest that this world and its phenomena are merely the perimeter of a total world, incapable of being understood unless we take account of deeper mystical dimensions. The problems of the cortex are problems of the relation of an enlarged being in the world with a narrowly perimetric one. They involve a distinction of levels, and that is why they are so intractable. Thank you.
Professor Findlay has consented to answer questions, if you have any, for perhaps about a half hour.
not sure that my question is necessarily involved with your predicament, but there is a predicament which is similar. This is the constant reference to something that the biologists call the genetic code. All this business about the DNA and the RNA, it's supposed to be a genetic code. Wouldn't this apply? There must be some reader. Can this be taken literally, or must it be taken figuratively, or maybe that distinction literal and figurative doesn't apply? But could you comment on what possible significance of that phrase, genetic code?
Well, it involves the mentality of what I call chercher la forme. When you have a difficult situation and some complicated thing keeps on being repeated, you are determined that you're going to find one simple factor somewhere, it's going to be produced. And if you are a romantic Frenchman, then it's somebody's lady friend. She is the source of all the complications in the relations of Poland with Nicaragua, or whatever it may be. But of course, the women are possibly among the causes of many disturbances. But no disturbance, political or otherwise, happens by their agency alone or by any agency. I mean, but involves a complex factor, a set of factors. Now, you have a similar psychology, you see, in the idea that I will discover some product which will be the source of anything. I will find some chemical, and that will be what is characteristic of the memory of a spring day. And I will take it out and I'll say that's spring. And if I remove it from you, I'll put you in the spring and you will have no spring feelings or anything like that, you see. And similarly, the genetic code. Well, I think everything one is always dependent on material arrangements. In giving this lecture, I'm terribly dependent on my notes. The notes, the things I've written down here, if I try to give without it, my performance would be confused. And I don't doubt that there are all kinds of curious substances and so on, which at certain stages of development, as it were, take the burden, are the sort of vehicles of a particular kind of creativity, which uses them in some way for the time being. And of course there are these substances, and of course there may be a substance. There may very well be. After all, if the reading of a poem or looking at a pressed flower can recall to me as past spring, why not a neuron specially delegated to this task? Or why not a factor or a code or something? This is perfectly possible. But the only thing that one objects to is the acceptance of this as a total explanation of what happens. That's all I would say. I would say that the whole thing is too complex to admit of this kind of simplicistic explanation. Yes.
I understand your discussion, especially the latter part. You are objecting to nervous system as the basis of our psychical activities. If that's the case, I think your discussion is primarily a question of difficulty rather than impossibility. You say, how can that be, and how can that be? There is one major premise.
Yes.
And there you have to make the point clearer, namely, whether we have to take the physical conditions as the basic factors for our so-called psychical activities, or some non-physical, non-observable. I'm not very clear whether in rejecting the physical, raising all sorts of difficulties which are really true, and no one has explained, as you rightly pointed out, how to explain. But it seems to me the kind of difficulty you raise is a difficulty argument rather than impossibility.
Well, I understand what you are saying, but I think you see that there are categorical difficulties as well as merely factual ones. You know, in Gulliver's Travels, he gives an account of the sages of Laputa, who's one of the sages of Laputa, who spent untold years trying to distill sunlight out of a cucumber, and so on. He hasn't achieved it yet, but he hopes that one day he will. Well, now the point is that there are inherent unsuitabilities in supposing that sunlight can be distilled out of a cucumber, you see. What I try to suggest is that there are logical difficulties in logical multiplicity and in logical structure between something which can intend something which doesn't exist or which is remote and something which merely has descriptive properties. I mean, of course you can attribute to neurons remote properties. You can say that the neuron thinks. You can say that the neuron thinks of the binomial theorem. You can say anything. But the question is, what do you mean by these statements? I'm not clear what is meant by them at all. They are just placebos. I mean, they're just ways of talking in order to produce mental quietude. They express no clarity, no clear concept of any sort at all. The point is this, that I think that many people in the history of thought try to solve category problems by empirical means, not realizing that while empirical research can sometimes cause a revision of categories, it cannot ever cause a complete and total revision of categories, only remove certain mistaken views of what is categorical. I think that what people have to learn is to give up certain things, and I'm sure that this will happen. You know, for a long time people thought, in the time of Kepler and so on, that the solar system had some precise set of geometrical measures. I mean, Mars was twice as far as Jupiter, or Jupiter, you know, some precise set of measures that you could work out, and we'd find the sort of golden key to it all, and we'd be able to give the, just as in Plato's Timaeus, the different planetary circles are all 1, 2, 3, 4, what is it, and 9, 16, 27, you know, each of the planets is at this distance from the center. Well, now we now know that this kind of numerical thing, beautiful as it would be to find, it doesn't exist, you see. I think people learn to give up things. I think that this particular kind of neural speculation or excessive neuralism will simply be found unfruitful and will be abandoned. Not that certain very profound and important discoveries will not be made by the way, certain things that have been discovered. There is localization of function. There are all kinds of other localizations and so on. I've no doubt there are very, very many that will be discovered. But I think that people will give up this whole tendency to think that that the cortex is a perfect face and that it does everything and so on. I think you say, I have merely said that it isn't, I based a claim to impossibility on difficulty. Yes, but difficulty has two sides. I mean, if a thing is so difficult that you can't get any further in it, isn't it possible you ought to give it up? And isn't that the right solution, rather than that you should go on indefinitely struggling and hammering at a door? And for what purpose? For something that doesn't explain anything. I mean, and for something of which there is no evidence at all. There is not one single well-established biological law in existence of any sort. Not one single generalization which is mathematically certain and exact. And of course there are no laws in physics either, because they're all statistical. Nonetheless, we all believe in the laws of nature because we love death. We love death, and we hope we'll be able to commit suicide and turn ourselves into the likeness of the dead things that we admire. That is the basic wish. It is the desire. The early use of science in the time of Bacon was to control nature and to make it useful for men's purposes. The modern use of science is to remove the humanity of man and to turn him into a dead thing as soon as possible and start controlling him by dead forces for no purpose whatever. This is what they hope to do. This is the demonic aim of these scientific or so-called scientific people. Let them abate their...
Demean matter.
What?
I think you demean matter.
Yes.
You demean matter.
Well, I don't wish to demean matter. I think there is such a thing as dispositional consciousness, something which is at a higher and advanced stage, ready to become consciousness, but which isn't actually conscious.
Animals that have consciousness we have no experience of.
Yes.
That's supposed to start all together in the cosmos. But we don't just jump out of our we just can't jump out of our human skins into every kind of species.
No. But I have a great deal of dispositional consciousness, which manifests itself in what I actually am conscious of and in what I do without actually becoming conscious. And I am very willing to admit that this is something that applies at levels where there is no consciousness at all. I mean, I think that my ganglia of my sympathetic system and the things that regulate my digestion are responsible, have a high degree of universality in their performance, have many very high-grade tendencies, and so forth. So I'm not really entirely...
Faculties of the mind and so forth, which are quite astounding.
Yes.
Which we don't know what's happening.
Good.
Really enjoyed your speech. I especially enjoyed your picturing of the phenomenological part of consciousness as an aristocrat who sits there with henchmen who bring him information, who moderate his listening to the information, who moderate his integrating that information, and who take his commands, go out and do them. And I'm very glad that you're acutely aware of the fact that we are only aware of what our nerves tell us, and we only do what we can make our nerves do. Now, you made it clear throughout your speech that there was a complete difference in nature between the phenomenological side and the neural side. So it's unfortunate that you characterize both the aristocrat and the henchman as both men, because, as you made clear, they are two completely different types of thing. Now, what I'm interested in finding out, because they are two completely different types of thing, and because you picture the neural side as a parasite, or something that is completely important to the phenomenological side, the parasite, but still you depicted the phenomenological side as having some kind of control, mediation through universals which it experiences in itself over the neural system. Now I would like to know where the strings are pulled. As one of at the risk of being called a demon, I'm going to be assigned to studying the neural system a few years from now, and I'm acutely aware of the fact that the nerves that make my muscles move and the nerves that tell me that I'm touching wood are affected by rules that physicists have discovered. They're statistical, and rules that biologists is discovering and will continue to discover. And that there seems to be a rather strong correlation between A and B, A happening and then B happening. And so what I want you to tell me is where in the cortex, not necessarily position, but conceptually, how the strings are pulled, how the potentials are raised and lowered. I know that in each one of the neurons, whether it fires or doesn't fire is determined by what the potential across the membrane is. This is true of every neuron, and you're very acutely aware of the fact that to move my arm, there has to be a lowering of the potential. And for me to draw a picture of or write a book, or for you to write your speech, requires you to lower those potentials on the basis of the universals you perceive. I'd like to know where the phenomenological side of you pull those strings, exactly how it changes the potential in each one of the nerve cells in exactly the right way so that you can write your speech the way you did.
Well, I am not an expert on telling you how to adjust potentials or how to do these other feats that you are mentioning, but I'm perfectly clear that they can be done. I mean, just as I can switch off a light or something like that by simply moving a switch. So I think that...
Well, the point is there is a causal change. There is a change from A to B to C.
Yes, certainly, but largely filled in by your superstitious belief in the completely explanatory nature of what you have there, which you've never proved and do not know, you see.
Well, I'm asking, what is the nature of the interaction? I mean,
I think there is a universal presence, and there are certain relations among universals. 2 and 2 is 4. This is somehow also a feature in the whole total scene, and the impulse might go this way or that way, but 2 and 2 is 4, if it goes this way.
well, I'm clear about that. What I'm picturing in my mind is that there seems to be a chain. Biologists seem to be finding the chain from the sensory to the motor, very continuous chain.
Yes.
You're picturing, for me, some sort of universals that are superimposed on that have an effect.
Yes, I do. I am precisely believing that. I am precisely believing that. I believe that forms are causes. I believe that universals move
In
things.
the picture, the universals are everywhere.
Yes. Yeah.
Including in the cortex, and perhaps our phenomenological experiences derive
Yes,
through those
yes.
universals. There is no reason to believe that it isn't a perfect face. As a matter of fact, they're just two aspects of the same thing. One side is the side that's superimposed on every neuron, the phenomenological side. The other side is the objective that we can intend towards. But there is no necessary difference or divergence. You can't split them into two people like henchmen.
No. Well, you see, I don't
They're
admit.
two layers of the same thing.
Well, you see, I don't admit this pre-established harmony doctrine. I don't think it's possible that something which is not in itself such as to take account of universals and their relations is such as automatically to behave as if it did take account of them. This I do not understand or believe. I do not. I mean, the people in the 17th century said that God did it. God correlated the mechanical connections of the body with certain acts of will or acts of insight and so on. But I honestly think that you can credit God with better things than these mechanical miracles that you are they're giving. I see no reason to believe that something not intrinsically adjusted, not itself intentional, can do the feats of intentionality. I think this is a feat of faith of the most incredible audacity, to think that things will behave as if they understood, though they don't. I do not believe this.
No,
I reject it.
All I'm asking you to justify why you make the split so dramatic. I agree that you can't explain universals. You can't look at neurons and say, here you have the understanding of the concept of addition or the understanding of the notion of consciousness. I agree you can't look at any group of neurons by themselves or even the hormone flowing over the neurons. But I also agree that there has to be some sort of overlaying phenomenological type consciousness. But what I'm trying to find out is why you necessarily separate them, say that one can even have separate contents or isn't necessarily always directly correlated with the other. Just because they have to be divergent, I agree that they can't be the same thing. Why you can't say that they're different sides of the same coin? One looked at through one way, the other looked at through another.
Well, you
One
see,
felt, the other seen.
You see, it comes into these discussions of this modern identity hypothesis. You are now developing an older form of the theory, which was parallelism, and there were things like epiphenomenalism. Recently, it's been fashionable to talk about an identity hypothesis. I find this so devoid of any content, it's not even worth discussing. I mean, anything can be said to be identical with anything because everything has certain intimate relations with anything, and you can, and in a deep sense, in the Hegelian system, everything is identical with everything else. The point is that I don't think it's very profitable to predicate a very special identity of something with something that differs from it in logical type. And I think that neurons doing the things that they're described as doing, are not suitable candidates for, they don't correlate with remote references. That is all. I don't see how the two can be made to gear in with each other.
No. Logical proof of that is just a matter of not being able to see.
Well, well, surely this is very important. Supposing somebody says that this finger, that is the number 4, and you say, I don't see how that finger can be the number 4. After all, the number 4, there are 4 people. How can that finger be 4? And you say, well, now you're trying to prove, just because you can't see that this finger, it really is 4, just because you can't see it, you reject it. I reject it because it is a different sort of thing.
Well, I have to raise one question. We've been always talking about these great universals and these abstract operations, and this business of irreducibility. But any slight, tiniest sensation one has is not a matter of physical, it cannot be reduced to a nervous stimulus. Any type of sensation that any animal has, any sentience at all, is in the immaterial realm, just as much as any act of symbolic imagination or anything else is. I mean, this whole idea that it's just high-level consciousness, the great philosophical universals that show this extreme disconnection, this peculiar, absolute disconnection between this subservient, subordinate matter and the other. It's not
well, the only thing is that if there is a very close correlation between two entities, so such that whenever the one appears, the other appears, there is sense in saying they are the same thing, or two manifest. I mean, if, for instance, if I walk along and whenever I go, my shadow goes with me, there is sense in regarding my shadow as, in a sense, part of myself.
Well,
but to regard that as a part of me, since it doesn't walk with me, would be rather foolish. But I perfectly agree with you, excepting that I think that things like sensations are not very strong arguments, whereas I think these other...
To me, they're as strong as anything else. The sensations are mental. All sensations are mental.
Yes. Well, I don't question this, and I think other properties can be discovered of them which would strengthen your argument. Yeah.
I think we're running a little short of time. There are some other people that would like to get into the discussion. So may I call on Dr. Rodier?
Yes.
I was very interested in the active state of the after having said that philosophy arose from our being, as it were, trapped by a figure, sounding illusionally and true, but not power. What grounds do you have for thinking, though, that one might get out? After all, what about the Aristotelian option?
Yes. Well, I quite agree with you that I didn't offer you very strong reasons in this particular paper, but I myself believe in the Platonic argument that the absurdity of this life points to the fact the basic philosophical puzzles point to an eschatological explanation, that is, to a completion of this type of experience by other sorts of experience in which these puzzles fade away. And I find this kind of thing worked out in a remarkable way in Neoplatonism. But this I don't expect to convince people of, and but I just like to bring it in because it's just to jolt people. I mean, to make them consider it as a live option. That is all. I don't expect, I quite agree with you what you have said, the Aristotelian option would be sufficient to cover this kind of thing.
You have 2 or 3 minutes, perhaps. Hear another question?
Does anybody else want to ask a question for Rahim? Yes.
There's the fact that when you have a complete explanation of conscious experiences in terms of neurological cause, and even when the rest of it is included, one couldn't explain how physical processes result in conscious expressions. Does that mean then that somehow the answer to the way in which these can be ultimately correlated is to be found in some other life, some other kind of type of experience, and never to be found in our ordinary empirical experience?
No, I was not saying that quite. If, for example, I differ from this lady in that I would say that if you could find a perfect logical isomorphism between our inner experiences and and certain neurological things, I wouldn't. The difference of quality alone wouldn't worry me. I mean, I would be willing to regard them as the same thing, as it were, functioning in a different dimension or manifesting itself in a different manner, and so on. I mean, if I worked like a computer and there were a precise way in which the results tallied with the way the thing was put together and the principles on which it worked, then I would be perfectly willing to accept this. It's because I do not believe in a precise correlation. As Aristotle said, there are certain functions of the human psyche for which there is not a bodily organ. That is, if we examine while they are carried out in part through various bodily means, there are certain parts of them, that is the understanding of the remote meanings and objective connections involved, which are not plainly mapped on the neural thing. And it is for that reason that I say we have to distinguish between them. And I, in fact, believe in the significant possibility. I'm not affirming it as a certainty, but I believe in the significant possibility of what we will call disembodied existence is a very interesting thing, and of the bringing of all things into a sort of higher unity. That is, I believe that mysticism is philosophically significant, and it completes the whole arch of human experience. It's not a kind of additional nonsense of an uninterpretable kind. It is the real completion of the whole arch of experience. And in that sense, I believe in these explanations that you have mentioned. But I think that if the other thing could be made to work, which I don't think it can, if you could get precise correlation, then I wouldn't object to these types of theory that people hold. Yes.
I was wondering if you might clarify for me something about reductionism, as we're talking about tonight. What I want you to clarify is talk about the sensation that one might have, let's say, blueness or greenness, as opposed to the electric streams that go through the nerve cells that are readily identifiable when we find the nerve cells.
Yes.
You say these are distinct, that they're different, that, well, there's really no way of reducing one to the other. They're two different types of things. Well, what I want you to clarify is, I know that my consciousness holds greenness. I want you to clarify how it can possibly make a comparison between that and what it doesn't hold. The nerve impulses that go through my brain. All I have right now is I believe all I have right now is the feeling, the essence of the idea of nerve impulses going through the brain. Now, reductionism implies that you can't reduce, non-reductionism implies that you can't reduce the impulses to the greenness. I don't think anyone's trying to claim that. I think they're trying to claim that there's a logical relationship between, if you want to call it the essence of greenness, and the essence, the ideas of the nervous system going through my brain. In other words, how can you possibly have conscious awareness of non-awareable things? I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to, if I phrased it properly, but it seems to me that reductionism, the concept of reductionism and non-reductionism, it makes no sense, simply because you can't have both things that you're trying, that one which you're trying to reduce the other in consciousness. You can only have in consciousness the one thing that consciousness can have. And you might call them essences. They might be related to each other. For instance, what I see from my brain and what I also see from ideas. Am I phrasing it properly?
I understand you partly, but I don't accept your philosophy of consciousness, because I think the very essence of consciousness that it can deal with things which aren't there at all and which don't need to correspond to anything real. I think they may honestly, your question would be too complicated for me to answer in this on this occasion, because it involves going into really very many questions. So if you'll forgive me, I won't pursue it any further.
Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we've detained Professor Findlay as long as we ought to, but would you be willing to hear one more, perhaps? Do you have a question?
Could I ask a question that doesn't necessarily have to do with the election tonight, but something you wrote in the past? I was particularly interested in this quite a while ago. You wrote an article on it apparently proved that the Anselm ontological argument, instead of proving theism, can be interpreted to prove the opposite, namely to prove atheism rather than theism. And my question is, do you remember?
Yes, I know this argument is this article is very well known to many. Yes, been much.
Pardon?
Yes, I know this article. Yes.
Yeah, but now you see, I think your argument was primarily that the concept of God was of such a nature that he couldn't possibly exist. The Anselm's idea.
Yes.
And now, my question is simply is what happened to this? Further development. Did you convince the others that there are people like Hartshorne and others who still accept the Anselmian argument?
No, I accept the Anselmian argument myself. I didn't, but I rejected it because on certain premises, which, if those premises are true, my argument is absolutely valid. It's a perfectly, what I said there is certainly true, granted that that all predications of existence are contingent and so forth, as Kant and others have maintained, and that all existence statements are synthetic. The argument is perfectly valid. The point is that these arguments are a sort of stonewall, are really built in favor of certain kinds of empiricism and so forth, which I think are questionable. And I think the result, if you do try to construct the notion of a necessary being, you do and have to get and the necessary being is necessarily very different from what people have supposed him a necessary being to be. And I think this is what moves me in a Platonic type of direction. That is, I think it is very much more accurate to think of what is necessarily is as being of the nature of something universal rather than of something particular. I think particulars are deeply contingent. You and I are contingent. We are just instances of this or that. We are not the things themselves. I think that in Platonism you find precisely this given as a reason for repudiating the particular as being the basic type of entity. And I think this is the direction in which it must go. But it's not where Hartshorne accompanies me. It's the lonely path that I tread by myself.
Well, thank you very much.